Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the day 4 of the Gyan course on culturally empowering teacher training through language and literature. We have an engaging schedule lined up for today, comprising 2 lectures and 1 tutorial. Today, we are honored to be joined by Professor Anisur Rahman, an eminent scholar, poet, and translator, whose wide-ranging contributions to literature and education continue to inspire generations of readers, researchers, and teachers alike. He has also long been associated with Aligarh Muslim University and the Department of English, where he is warmly regarded as a mentor, collaborator, and guiding intellectual presence. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Anisur Rahman, who will be delivering lectures on why study literature, a teacher's perspective, as a national faculty for this Gyan course. Professor Rahman is a distinguished literary scholar, translator, and poet, formerly a professor of English at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, and currently serving as senior advisor to the Rekhta Foundation, the world's largest platform dedicated to language, literature, and culture. Born in 1950, Professor Rahman has made wide-ranging contributions to comparative literature, translation studies, Urdu literature, and post-colonial studies, with a particular focus on the literary traditions of South Asia, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Professor Rahman has also held several key academic and administrative positions at Jamia Millia Islamia, including head of the Department of English, Dean of Students' Welfare, Director of the Center for Coaching and Career Planning, and as Registrar. He has represented Indian Academia internationally as a Shastri Fellow at the University of Alberta, Canada in 2001 and 2002, and as a visiting scholar at Purdue University. His scholarly portfolio includes 4 authored books, 6 edited or co-edited volumes, His scholarly portfolio includes 4 authored books, 6 edited or co-edited volumes, and 2 collections of Urdu poetry in English translation. Among his recent and celebrated works are Earthenware 60 Poems, published by Rublik Publishing, in translation, Positions and Paradigms, published by Orient Baxtron in 2019, Hazaro Khwaishe Aisi, The Wonderful World of Urdu Ghazals, published by HarperCollins in 2019, Socio-Literary Cultures in South Asia, published by Neogi Books, and most recently, Hazar Rang Shairi, The Wonderful World of the Urdu Nazm, and Essential Ghalib, both published by HarperCollins in 2024. In 2024, his landmark work, Hazaro Khwaishe Aisi, was honored with the Sahitya Academy Prize for Translation, recognizing its immense contribution to making Urdu ghazals accessible to a wider audience. The book was also featured in episode 8 of Signings podcast, Kitab Column, as the first ever comprehensive anthology of Urdu ghazals in English, spanning from the 16th century to the present and spotlighting 65 poets across 7 literary periods. In a heartfelt tribute to his legacy, Urdu Alive released a special issue dedicated entirely to Professor Rahman's literary journey, featuring interviews, critical essays, and translated classics. Recently, he has been delighting readers across Delhi, signing books and engaging in literary conversations at iconic spaces like Farikh Chand and Sons, Midland Bookshop at South Extension in Hoskas, and Kunzum Bookstore at Greater Kailash. On the left, we see the poster from the book discussion hosted by the HSS Research Scholars Group at IIT Delhi in April 2025, where Professor Rahman presented his latest work, The Essential Ghalib, published by HarperCollins India. In this volume, he offers a remarkable selection of Mirza Ghalib's Urdu couplets, translated into English with lucid commentary that makes the layered meanings of Ghalib's poetry accessible to modern readers. On the right is a poster from an international event titled What Lies Between Mirrors? 5 Centuries of Urdu Poetry in English Translation, held by the Indian Diaspora in Washington, D.C. in 2023. This session showcased Professor Rahman's contributions through his edited volumes Hazaro Khwaishe Aisi and Hazar Rang Shairi, which bring together Urdu ghazals and nazms spanning several centuries. Together, these events reflect Professor Rahman's enduring commitment to preserving and promoting the richness of Urdu literature across linguistic and cultural borders. They also speak of his unique ability to bridge the classical and contemporary, the regional and the global through the art of translation. Professor Rahman, we are honored to have you with us today, and I am sure your insights will leave us with much to reflect on, both as lovers of literature and language and as teachers of it. I invite Professor Anisur Rahman for his lecture titled Why Study Literature? A Teacher's Perspective. The lecture duration will be 2 hours. Participants are kindly requested to keep their questions or comments ready. These will be addressed at the end of each lecture. Before the lecture, we will felicitate Professor Anisur Rahman. I invite Professor Mohammad Rizwan Khan to felicitate, sir. I invite Professor Anisur Rahman to deliver the lecture.
You have mic?
Mike?
I'll be there. I'll be there. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. It's a kind of a homecoming because one has been here many a time at this dais and in this hall. Pleasure, great pleasure. The introduction that was being given about me was very embarrassing for me to see with my own open eyes what all was said about me and what I could see. I admire the researcher who found so much material and put together. Your name is Maria. I heard him. My daughter's name is also Maria. And the topic is so simple that everyone has an answer. And the topic is why you study literature. This is title one. This is talk one. And after that, the second talk that is there is reading literature comparatively. So these are the two talks that I have to deliver, I think one after another. Because I have to go back today itself, I cannot make it for another day. That's why I requested Rizwan Saab to let me and allow me to leave today only. Because the book that she referred to last, that is the Essential Ghalib, which is a selection of 200 verses from Ghalib with translation and annotations, has left me nowhere in the sense that there is something happening almost every day. Last 2 months have gone to the celebration of that book. So that makes me happy and that makes my readers happy. And I'm personally very, very satisfied with the work. That is what brings me to the talk that I'm going to deliver. Now, everyone has an answer to this question, why you study literature. Everyone has an answer. And you might be also amused that what this man is going to speak about because you already know about what is literature and why you study literature. You might read it for pleasure, you might read it for instruction, for getting education, etc., etc. Similarly, there are so many definitions and so many studies already carried out about what is literature itself. So the first question is what is literature? And then comes naturally the corollary, the question, the second question, which is why you study literature? So once you know what is literature, you raise this question, after all, why you study literature? Now, the very concept of literature has changed drastically. And in my own career, I have seen this changing fast. And you are very lucky to have been born in an age, in a time in which drastic changes are taking place. We could never imagine, even in dreams, we couldn't even dream that there will be a time when AI will come, artificial intelligence. I'm totally unaware of that, but you can't afford to be unaware of that. You have to go with that. And with that, you have new ways of looking at it, new ways of looking at text, new ways of looking at literature, and the very context that it is written into. That is a word. What is a word after all? And how does this word changes its nature, its color, its form when it comes into a context, when it is used in a poem or in a short story or wherever, any narrative, which will be a prose narrative or a poetic narrative. So the whole transformation that has taken place is very, very interesting. I started with the I read a very interesting essay by Jean-Paul Sartre, What is Literature? And in that he defines and says that literature is essentially an expression of human angst. That was an existential view of literature. Human angst. That is the bodies, the human predicament that you pass through, the historical predicament, the social, cultural, personal predicament through passing history and cultures and time spans. So it is about the worries, the issues that we face, the challenges that we face, and as a result of that, the angst that we face. This is what Jean-Paul Sartre basically comes to tell us. But if you go back and if you go forward, you will find that it has been defined in so many other ways as well. Literary theorists, many of them, especially the Marxist theorists, especially say that literature is something which is a written word. And therefore, you could say that a leaflet or a booklet that you get after buying any material from the market, like, for example, a refrigerator or a TV or a file of medicine that you buy, you have something, some paper lying into it, a leaflet is there or a booklet is there. That is also a part of literature, according to one definition. So that is literature, and we often say कि इसका literature देखिए कहाँ है और क्या लिखा है इस refrigerator के बारे में. So read that. But that is a different kind of a literature. That is not the literature which we are going to talk about and which we have been studying in the class and outside the class and research. Even to the extent that an FIR lodged in a police station is a piece of literature. So anything that you write, so where is the root? The root is the word. Word is the root. And the word also has a very interesting thing. If you go with the history of the word, you will find, and that is what you will understand while you study literature and what is literature basically. You speak a word, anything, mic, for example. This is a word. But if you write it on the blackboard or on the whiteboard, which is used these days with a black ink or a white chalk, then you will see that it has got a figure, WORD. It has got a figure, right? But when you look at this mic, the mic is also an image. So the word transforms from word to image. Now, in the hand of a writer, this image does not remain an image only. It becomes a simile also. This mic is better than this, right? This mic is better than this. This classroom is this book better than that, etc. So you compare. Now, from one stage to another, you are going deeper and deeper and deeper into the layers of meaning. When you come to study literature, you explore this, that where is the depth? Depth of what? The depth of human emotions, what you learn from life, how you reflect upon life, how you get your instruction, how you get amused or how you get your entertainment or how you get enlightened. Up there, from word to image and from image to simile. What would be the next step? Can anyone tell me after simile? Metaphor. You come to metaphor. Now, all poets will not be able to create a metaphor. Some metaphors are very easy to create because they are traditional metaphors, right? They're very traditional metaphors. You can easily say that this means this. This metaphor stands for this. Metaphor, if you go to understand metaphor, go back to Coleridge's Biography of Literarian. And in chapter 13, he talks about imagination. And the sum and substance of it is that stronger the imagination of the poet, better the poem. And where lies the heart of the poem? In a metaphor, in a simile, in an image, or in the word that is so powerful. But the story does not stop there. If you are a student of literature, you go beyond metaphor because metaphor is not the end of the whole story. After metaphor, what is the next step? Symbol. You create a symbol. Now, some symbol are one-to-one correspondence symbol. A rose, standing for love. My love is like a red, red rose, Robert Burns. There it is being used as a simile, but it's also a symbol of love. Rose garden of heavens, which is in the Christian mythology also, and you have this also coming in most of the literary text where heaven has been constructed as a rose garden. And everyone in Rumi's poetry, heaven is rose garden. Rumi की शायरी में जो फारसी की शायरी है उसमें जो जो जन्नत का तस्वुर है, जो बहिश्त का तस्वुर, उसमें रोज गार्डन बहुत है. Fragrance is there, images are there, images of blooming rose. So from there you go on to metaphor, from metaphor you go to the symbol. And finally there is one more stage where the writer comes and stops because there is nothing beyond that. What he does, that he transforms his metaphor into symbol and symbol finally into a myth. Myth is the end of the old story. It's not easy to create myths. Very few have been able to create myths. As the students of literature, you will find that how many poets and how many fiction writers or non-fiction writers you remember out of the 700 years history of English literature, starting from Geoffrey Chaucer, 1400, how many years? 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 21st. 700 years. This is the 21st year. So in 700 years, how many poets do you remember are really canonical poets and who have created myths? Chaucer, after that is Spencer, after that Milton, after that Pope, after that John Donne, after that Coleridge. I'm not counting all others, Coleridge. After that W.B. Yeats, T.S. Eliot, and I'm not going beyond T.S. Eliot. 12 names have come to my mind. Similarly, if you count fiction, you will also find in fiction you have about 10 names that come before you. So out of 700 years, how is it that you remember only 10, 12 names from each field of literature? This is because they have been able to create and pass on from one stage to another and really created myths of being, myths of belonging, myths of your own lives, myths of your own surroundings. So society is transformed into some kind of a symbol or is some kind of a myth. And then in the myth, you don't think that myth is only just constructed. Myth is something which is made out of surroundings that we are here. And we recognize, well, in this myth, I lie here. This is my position. This is my place. This is my society. This is what these myth makers are also known as those who create the science of a particular civilization or a cultural heritage. Those myth makers. There has been longer talk about world literature. People have talked lots about world literature. In the beginning, I was not very sure what is meant by world literature. क्या कोई world citizen है हमारे दरमियान? Is there any world language? There is no world language. Is there any world culture? There is no world culture. So I often question myself 20 years ago, what is this world literature after all? Of which there is no citizen, of which there is no language, of which there is no particular culture. तो बाद में समझ में आया कि those who have the power to create the metaphor and the symbol and the myth are those people who have created a stock of literature, who have become the powerhouses of world literature. Like, for example, come to the Urdu poetry, you will feel Mir is a person who belongs to world literature. Ghalib is a person who belongs to world literature. Coleridge is one, if you go to English, who belongs to world literature, the heritage of the world literature. T.S. Eliot and W.B. Yeats qualified to be in the world. Gita is world literature. Ramayana and Mahabharata are world literature. And several such examples you will have. You will see that these are the examples of world literature. So why you study literature? There are many answers to this. And that is what I was saying, that what is the journey of this word and how you will start and how you move forward and how you gain momentum with this and how you acquire that. So we study literature simply because there are many answers. Each one of you will have an answer. You read it for your own instruction. You want to get some knowledge. You want to enlighten yourself. Some information, some entertainment, and barely as a matter of routine that you read it because you have no other work to do and you just read it and you find that it entertained you for a while. There are many ways of looking at it. So the text is made of the word. Word is the nucleus of all. And the text is made of the word, composed and constituted of the word. And words put in a certain order make all the difference. A very simple explanation of what is poetry and what is prose. Mallarmé, the French critic, says that words in best order is prose. Simple. Words in the best order, the best words in the best order, prose. The best words in the best order, this is prose. But best words in the best order is poetry. Because in poetry you have precision. You don't have 5, 6, 7, 10, 12 pages. So words in best order. But in poetry, you don't have that much of a space. You have to be very precise. You have to be very, say, very laconic. So best words in best order. That is one definition. So what happened in the whole journey of why we study literature, these things have started mattering to us. And therefore, words developed into text. And what is a text? A text is a conglomeration, not only of the lexical patterns, but of experiential patterns, of history. So a text is in itself not only that is which is written in a page of 100 pages bound into a book. That is not all that you have. That is not all that you know as text from one end to another end. That is not text. Text is something which is a configuration or a conglomeration of words that transform themselves into a cultural material, words that become historical material as well. So those words spell us out. Those words spell our lives out, our cultures out, our anthropologies and our mysteries and our mythologies. And that is why we read literature, to understand who we are. To understand who we are, because literature tells me, who am I? Why is it that a student of English goes to Urdu? I'll tell you that story later in the second part of my talk, which when I come to talk about comparative and why comparative literature. So this is how this travel is. So you go from reality to fantasy, from reality to fantasy. And fantasy is something which you might on the very first occasion say that this is something which you need not take into consideration, because why after all worry about fantasy which is not real? But fantasy is so deeply rooted into realities. Fantasy emerges out of reality. So if you have read some works of Salman Rushdie, you will see how fantasy works. Or the works of magic realism. If you read that, you will see how fantasy works there and how reality is transformed into some kind of a material that engages your imagination immediately. And you are drawn towards that, and you become so accustomed to that that you started reading with, for example, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, and things like that. So many others are right there. Losau passed away 2 days ago. So these masters you start reading, and then you start culling your sources from there, getting your sources and trying to understand. So this is about the study of human nature, a study about a civilizational pattern, a cultural pattern, through a linguistic background that we have developed into, and how we mature with our literatures and how we study literature. And that is why we study literature, because these are the simple answers. In so many ways you can give it. Now, there is one thing which we also need to understand: why we study literature and why we write literature also, and what is literature. For example, there are one word which has been used very frequently in modern criticism, especially during the last 20, 30 years, 25, 30 years. And the word is representation. आपने बहुत बार पढ़ा होगा ये लफ्ज़. Representation. What do we mean by representation? Is presentation also representation? कोई बताए? Is presentation also a representation? Anyone? No. Presentation is not representation. That is why I raise this question. For example, if I asked you to write an essay on this hall, so you will write that there are 10 rows. In each row, these many students are sitting. This is the size of the room. And this is the time when someone is speaking and addressing a student. This is an essay on a room. This is an essay on a room, which is a presentation of this room. You present this room in your words. You create a picture of this room, of this hall in words. Anyone who will read will understand, well, this is the hall in which something was happening at this point of time. And you see, this is the size, and these many people are sitting there, and there was a mic, and there was a voice, etc., etc. So the real picturization is presentation, something which is real, something which you can touch, taste, feel that this is real. This cannot be anything else but real. But if you write a story about this room, about this hall, about the people who are sitting here, me and you, it will not be a story of the exact presentation of this room. It will change. In that story, there will be a character. The same situation will be there, but there will be characters. There will be a plot. There will be a conversation. Something will be happening. So this hall will transform itself into a stage of life where some drama is being played. So this room does not remain a room. This is not a presentation now. When a writer writes about this hall, it becomes a representation. Representation is a story. Representation is a poem in which your imagination works. So with the imagination, with the handiwork of imagination, you turn the real into representational. You turn the real into fantasy. You turn the real into something about which you have to think and then you have to identify. Well, this was the place where I was. What literature helps you do is that it helps you put your fingers on the spot where he was trying you to put your finger. Now, this is also a very difficult question to answer because you never know the meaning of the text. The meaning of the text is always very, very evasive. Modern theory tells us that there is no meaning. Language is also very changing a state, is mutational. It keeps on changing day in, day out, moment after moment. So these are very important stages to think of, to ponder over, and to understand what literature basically is and why we study. We study literature because we want to see the representation. How is this life being represented? How am I being transformed? How the same person that you meet day in, day out in the life, that same person in a story will appear as a different kind of a person to you, but the real merit of that person will come before you when you read that person's story. So in the story or in the poem that you read, you have the same persons coming forth before you and coming before you, and then you realize them, you recognize them, and you find them, well, there they are. So that is how it works, and that is how it makes us gets us interested into that text, and we start reading that text. We find our. Now, I was talking about this imagination. Through the handiwork of imagination, this room has transformed into something which you recognize later in a story, and how it makes great sense to you. But you will also have a thing which is known as fancy. आपने सबने सुना होगा imagination के साथ. It doesn't take your imagination to any kind of a flight. It doesn't help you take your wings and spurs and then materialize that. Fancy doesn't help you there. It is imagination that helps you there, in which the secondary imagination, the primary, and the primary imagination was just talking, there is a microphone, there's a microphone, nothing beyond this. But in secondary imagination, there's not a microphone. It helps me reach out to you, and it has a different kind of mythological meaning with it has been. So I was just talking about that earlier. So imagination is the final work which we have to take into account. When you create a literature, it is the imaginative faculty of the writer. And as I said, greater the imagination of the poet, the stronger the chances of getting the text a longer life. And that is how we study the great pieces of literature, and literary texts are left behind, which have not stood the test of time. As I said, in 700 years of English literary history, how many poets have really come to you that you will remember as the classics, or as those who have hold the canon and who are the canon makers and who stay with that canon? That was what I thought about. So it is about the creativity that is inflamed when you study a piece of literature. It is the development of your own faculty. That is why you want to study literature, not only for instruction. You study literature for the development of your own imaginative faculty, your own prowess and your own power to think further and to identify with a particular. Why is it, after all, that you write like a particular author, you don't like another? There must be some reason behind that. You identify with some authors, but you don't identify with others. You like a particular linguistic construction, you don't like another linguistic construction. It's a matter of your own taste, your own way of looking at a text or the material that is being handled by the text or by the author. So this will result into the response, which is known as the reader response. You respond to a text in your own particular manner. So every reader has a way of responding to it. That is why we study literature, because each of us will read a text in a different manner, and there lies the beauty of the text. There lies the beauty of that text, which brings in so many ways of interpretation. Now, interpretation itself is a very, very difficult word these days. These days are these words of meaning, interpretation are challenged, because modern theory tells us that meaning is something which you cannot determine. Language is something which you can't determine for sure. We don't know what language is basically. But given the facts that we are engaging with every day, day in, day out in the text, we recognize something. That is why Salim Sinai of Midnight Children becomes such an important figure to you. That is why some of the characters, like, for example, you must have read Wuthering Heights. You must have come across Heathcliff, the story of Heathcliff. So Major Iago, for example, in Shakespeare. Lady Macbeth, for example, and these are those canonical characters who stay with you. How they have been created, Shakespeare or Donne or Hemingway, the old man. And several dozens and dozens of characters like that who come across. Or a person who is walking in that wonderful, say, place, Robert Frost, I'm talking of, stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Now you can imagine that person, how he was stopping. I saw that place where he was, and where the particular place which he walked, and and it was just before that was spread. It is Frost Estate. It is a huge estate. Robert Frost used to live there, and it's a whole area in Bloomington, close to Bloomington, and it's very big, huge area. No, not Bloomington, southern Hampshire. So it's a huge area, and trees are there, and I can imagine how the snow must be falling there, and how a particular person is walking there, and then he sees a horse, and then now he's become an iconic character. The person who was walking, the horse stops, the horse wonders why this man is stopped here. He has to go to the town, and then the finally, whose woods are deep, whose woods are these? I think I know. ये जंगल किसका जंगल है? मैं शायद जानता हूँ. I did translate this poem earlier, long time back. And then at the end, the story comes to an end when he says, promises to give, and miles to go before I sleep. Now, sleep, that is why some people say it is a death poem. It is a death wish. Maybe, may not be, because there are many ways of looking at a text. Reader response varies from reader to reader. So that is why we study literature. We study literature because there are many ways of looking at a text. Because each word carries a different meaning. For one writer, for the writer, one meaning, but maybe for the reader, another, and yet another, and yet another meaning. So that is why at one point of time in the 60s, someone was enthused to write a book, Seven Types of Ambiguity. William Emerson. William Emerson wrote a book called Seven Types of Ambiguity. One was flabbergasted when we came to know that we thought that ambiguity is of just one type. You mean this, but you don't mean this. It's very ambiguous a statement. But Emerson told us that no, gentlemen, there are seven types of ambiguity. Then comes Richards, close to him, I.A. Richards. He says that Principles of Literary Criticism, you read that, or Practical Criticism, both of his books were very popular when we were students. So he tells us how words really function. And I. Richards was such a simple man. He used to work, and I saw the place where he used to teach, that is in Oxford. And these are the people who really made us understand the literary text and the word. Then comes T.S. Eliot before us. But before that, there is another very important figure who is there and who is very canonical, and that is W.B. Yeats. And then in W.B. Yeats also, there are many, many poems. For example, Second Coming. Why do you study Second Coming again and again? Why do you study any poem that you can name by W.B. Yeats? Come on. You must have read it. What? Sailing to Byzantium. There are two poems. One is Byzantium, and the other is Sailing to Byzantium. He wants to go back to Byzantium and says, this is not the country for me, young man. I have to go back to Byzantium. But a much more complex poem is Byzantium. Sailing to Byzantium is rather simpler, but a very complex poem is Byzantium, and where he makes a myth. I was talking about a myth. So he makes Byzantium, turns and transforms Byzantium into a myth. Very good that you remembered Sailing to Byzantium. Among the school children is another great poem that he has left us with. Lake Isle in his free earlier stage of W.B. Yeats. But these are very powerful poems. Among school children is one such poem which will stay with you if you read that poem all your life. Byzantium will stay with you, Sailing will stay with you, and several other poems, Leda and so on, will stay with you. So these are the texts which really stay with us because Byzantium has been turned into a myth. It is no longer a symbol. It transforms the stage of symbol and becomes a myth. That is why we study literature. We study literature, we recognize how and where those seminal moments of our lives are lying, and we have to explore that. So we keep on reading and reading, and maybe at one point of time, you come across a text which holds your imagination. And after that, even a writer who has been writing very well starts slipping later. A very good example is of Vikram Seth. He came with a big thump with his first novel, Suitable Boy. No, before that, which is in verse, which is in Golden Gate. Now, after that, this book came, The Suitable Boy, but he doesn't write any longer. Because sometimes it becomes very difficult for a writer to excel himself. He says he's very conscious after that. Every writer who has succeeded becomes very conscious because he doesn't want to slip on the next book. He doesn't want to lose his. One of our colleagues, Mukul Kesavan, wrote a very famous novel, uh, Looking Through the Glass. है ना? Now that novel made him very famous. But I often ask Mukul कि आप दूसरा क्यों नहीं लिखते हो? So he writes book about him, cricket and other things, essays, books of him. Because he's very, not only he, but every writer who gains some name, who becomes important, who is read everywhere, is very, very shaky about writing the second novel. Because the second novel must also retain his position that he has already created. And he is very scared if his readers will reject him later. That is why, after the very important work that one has produced, exploring for the ground for the next work for every writer is very difficult, because the reader is a big judge sitting at the other end. And therefore, the time of canonicity of a writer that he's bothered about. He's bothered about how canonical I am today and whether I'll be able to stay that canonical in the years to come. So these are some of the interesting images that you have in mind, which you think of, and that is how. These are some of the ways of looking. For example, as a teacher, when I teach a particular text, I found my interest in that particular text. In Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, I found myself. This is where one has to read and one has to go deeper. In John Donne, I found my interest. Any poem of John Donne you can take, and even his religious poems, the sonnets that he wrote. But fiction was not my area, so I can't speak about fiction with any kind of a specialization. Not criticism is my area, but poetry was my area right from my childhood, and all through my career I taught poetry, so one can talk about poetry. So starting from those 7, 8 names that I have given, these are the poets that held my imagination, the poets that I mentioned in the beginning. So that is how one went forward, and that is how I found myself, my literature. That is why I found that this is why I should study literature, and why I should not study something which my father wanted, maybe. My father was a doctor. He must have thought, and he did think, that I should become a doctor, because then I'll take his seat and be comfortable in life. That was not my area, because I was very weak in sciences. So I said, no, it can't do. He was very liberal. He was very modern mind thinking man. He said, no, go ahead. Then he wanted me to become a civil servant. So I said, okay. I qualified, but later on I was not taken in the final stage. Then he asked me, what do you want to do? I said, I want to study literature because I like literature. That is why I study literature. So this is where I lie, and this is where I lay. And that is why each one of you, as I said in the beginning, each one of you has a way of looking at it. Why I like literature, you have your answer. Now, to sum it up, I will just bring before you, and I want you to react to this. The question of reading literature in the post-colonial context is also a very difficult question. We study literature today for various political reasons. So in the context of the modern times, the literature that we are studying today has a very political decision that we study particular author. There is a political, the writing is political, the act of reading is very political. So everything is very political after the arrival of the post-colonial times. So we as citizens of the post-colonial world, our decisions are very political. So our choices of the text are political, our writings are political. So we study literature because there is a political reason. Once we study literature because there was a social or a cultural reason or a linguistic reason for that, to know language, to know culture, to know history, to know all kinds of interactions that people indulge into. But today you read literature into a different. So I started by saying that an FIR registered in a police station is a piece of literature, or a leaflet or a booklet that you get for anything that you buy from the market is a piece of literature. We have come round the circle. We have completed that circle. Today, again, we are back at the pavilion from where we started. Everything is literature. Now you look at what is being produced today. Huge amount of literature of various kinds, of various styles, of various linguistic configurations, some of which you might reject. For example, about 10 years ago, there was something called chick lit. Chick lit. So one of the students in the department was working on that. I said, okay, it's very fine, you know about it, but better write something on something which will stay for a while. In 2 years' time, chick lit will not be known. No one has been surprised here about chick lit. So she didn't understand, but later she repented that she should. So when you work, do something more substantial, because these are the things that you will know by yourself. If your eyes are open, if your ears are open, then you can see what is happening. So when you work as a students, as a PhD scholars or as teachers, work on something which is more substantial, which you can learn through. So the whole definition with which we have started that everything is literature today, also we say everything is literature. But you have to understand where you lie, where your dreams and fantasies lie, where your mythical authors lie, etc. Now I bring to you two things from our own literary culture, and I would like you to respond to this and see what kind of literary text is this. My examples are from Ghalib. You respond to this, you must have learned, you must have listened, and must have read it. Naqsh Fari, this is the first शेर ऑफ दीवान गालिब, पहला शेर है। और पहले ही शेर में दीवान गालिब के पहले ही शेर में गालिब ने बहुत बड़ा एक हमारे ऊपर टास्क रख दिया। नक्श फरियादी है, किसकी शौकी है तहरीर का, कागजी है पैरा हर पे करे तस्वीर का। कैसा रिस्पॉन्स है आपका? हाउ डू यू रिस्पॉन्ड टू दिस? व्हाट इज दिस पोएम? बिकॉज गालिब सेड और अदर्स आल्सो सेड कि ये मैंने एक बेमानी शेर कहा है, बट लेटर ही वाज टोल्ड दैट नो इट इज नॉट बेमानी, ये मुहम्मल नहीं है, बहुत मीनिंगफुल शेर है। सो व्हाट इज योर रिस्पॉन्स? आई रीड इट अगेन। नक्श फरियादी है, किसकी शौकी है तहरीर का, कागजी है पैरा हर पे करे तस्वीर का। समझ में आते हैं? क्या मानी समझ में आते हैं? जस्ट कम कन्वर्स। इट इज अ
trying to express himself on the words, in the page. Poetry, some imagination is there on his Kazi appearance. That his clothes are everything. His Kazi.
ephemeral.
There is this Marx critique when Walter Benjamin, he says that every piece of this literature or something, he says that it talks about the barbarism or it talks about the life outside. So that's, I think this is how God tries to represent life, and it talks of, he wants to talk about the journey of the poet through this.
Okay, this is one way of looking at it. Anyone else who can say something? And if I put a pointed question, what is this naksh? Naksh का मतलब क्या? Image? This image can be of a man. फरियादी, फरियाद करने वाला। तो फरियाद करने वाला एक आदमी। आगे बढ़े? Anyone? Take this further.
Yes, sir.
नक्श फरियादी है, किसकी शौक ये तहरीर का?
We get the other poems of Ghalib to find that he wrote some simple poems as well. For example,
नहीं, not that. I'm talking of this. Just concentrate on this. Simple तो बहुत है. दिल अदा तुझे हुआ क्या है? Come to this only. This is a very difficult one.
he says that everything in this universe actually make a question to his creator that if you are a perfect creator, you could have created such perfection in us, but we are left with such imperfection that
Right. You have come a little closer to the meaning.
Assistance of mankind.
Assistance of
Mankind.
किस तरह से?
Like I'm talking about his content, that how everything has been created.
आप कुछ करीब आए हैं? अच्छा, anyone else? कागजी है, नेक्स्ट लाइन है, कागजी है पैरहन हर पे करे तस्वीर का। देखिए, there is a what he does. It's a very powerful शेर. कपलेट नहीं कहूंगा, कपलेट और शेर में फर्क होता है. So this is a very powerful शेर, verse, and there is a myth behind it. And the myth is that in the ancient Persia, when a person who was oppressed used to go to the emperor asking for justice, मुझे इंसाफ चाहिए, कैसे जाता था वो? He used to wear a paper तुमने बनाया है। ये आदमी जो खून के छींटों के कपड़े पहन के आया है, वो तुमने बनाया है। कागजी है पैरहन। अब यह कहता है हमारे बारे में, हाउ ट्रांजिटरी वी आर, आवर ड्रेस इज ऑफ पेपर, and we also behind that are as soluble as the paper. हम भी उसी तरह मिट्टी में खत्म हो जाएंगे जिस तरह पेपर खत्म हो जाएगा बहुत जल्द। किसकी शोखी? इट्स a challenge to the emperor, it's a question to the king. In this manner, this is a poem about, this is a verse about power and powerlessness. Isn't it that you are talking today in theory about power and powerlessness? The modern theory that talks about, especially the post-colonial theory that talks about how the power and the powerless, the have and the have-nots, the category 1 and the category 2, the possessed and the possessor, the colonized and the colonizer. This is a poem about that. It's about power, it's about colonizer, it's about colonized, about its God, it's about man. It's such a huge, it's huge. In 2 lines, Ghalib has brought together entire discourse of power and powerlessness, which power mission everyone, every theorist is not. Ghalib has taken only 2 lines to write about the entire contemporary history in his times. He saw the decline and fall of the Mughal Empire and beyond. That is, the whole world was getting decolonized. 2 मिसरे में गालिब ने समेट दिया सारा कुछ. I bring a very clear example to you, another example which is from W.B. Yeats. Things fall apart and the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is most important. Things fall apart and the center cannot hold are so seminal that T.S. Eliot wrote an entire poem on that, The Wasteland. 2 लाइन W.B. Yeats की और 5 poems T.S. Eliot की. 5 sections, 5 ही है ना, 5 sections. So starting from Burial of the Dead to the end, Shanti Shanti, you see that Eliot is only writing about the barrenness of the time in which he lived. And W.B. Yeats in 2 lines. These are the myth makers. That is why we study literature. That is why we study literature, because we try to identify those people and those turns of phrases, and then we come to. So this was one example. एक और example, उसके बाद we will take a break for another talk. ये बहुत अजीब सा शेर है. ये है मीर का. और आप देखिए क्या कहना चाहते हैं मीर. मीर अगर आप लोगों ने नहीं पढ़ा है तो जरूर पढ़िएगा. गालिब तो सब, एवरीवन रीड्स गालिब, है ना. गालिब तो सभी पढ़ते हैं. मीर नहीं पढ़ा तो मीर जरूर पढ़िएगा. बहुत बड़ा शायर था, बहुत बड़ा. और मेरी नजर में बहुत बड़ा शायर है. गालिब को भी पीछे छूटता है बहुत सारी जगहों पे. शेख जो था मस्जिद में नंगा, रात को था मैं खाने में. सुनिए what he says and try to give me the meaning. शेख जो था मस्जिद में नंगा, रात को था मैं खाने में, जुब्बा खरका कुर्ता टोपी मस्ती में इनाम किया. इनाम में दे दिया सब कुछ. आई रीड इट अगेन. शेख जो था मस्जिद में नंगा, रात को था मैं खाने में, जुब्बा खरका कुर्ता टोपी मस्ती में इनाम किया. व्हाट इज इट ट्राइंग टू से? मस्जिद जैसी पाक जगह, शेख जी नंगे, मैं खाने में था. What is he trying to say? He's bringing in a huge discourse here. Huge philosophical discourse is coming into this verse. Sheikh, is a very archetypal character for the poetry. है ना? Not only Sheikh, और कौन-कौन से archetypal characters हैं? Saqi, yes, very good. Muqbacha, Saqi, नासिख, नासे, बहुत से हैं. So, हाँ. तो शेख जो था मस्जिद में नंगा, रात को था मैं खाने में. What does he? Anyone just come on? Any hint towards the meaning? The meaning lies in the second line. खरका जुब्बा कुर्ता टोपी मस्ती में इनाम किया. ये जो लिबास है ना, ये सब धोखा है. मीर कहते हैं कि लिबास कुछ नहीं है. ये जो जिस्म है ये है असल, और जिस्म के अंदर जो जान है वो असल. तो शेख ने पहचान लिया कि असल हकीकत क्या है. मैं कदे में थे और इतने पी ली थी कि उनको कुछ और नजर आने लगा. उसके बाद he saw something else. In Urdu poetry there is a huge you have to develop that understanding of what is the meaning of saqi. Saki is not only that person who gives you a cup of wine. Saki कोई और भी है. हौज़े कौसर का साकी कोई और होगा. रसूलुल्लाह होंगे. So he takes that meaning कि हौज़े कौसर का साकी भी एक है. Why not remember that saki? So here the Shaykh is one who has achieved that point of enlightenment. अब उसके लिए कपड़े की कोई वक़्त नहीं है. खरका टोपा बहुत से मौलवी मौलाना खुरका जो भी कुर्ता टोपी पहनते हैं just to create their kind of ambience about their personality. The Sheikh has now known the reality, has come to understand that reality. For him, it doesn't matter. उसने सब दे दिया. Therefore, you have this whole idea of the dress and the dresslessness, of the nakedness. And then you read that line from W.B. Yeats. There is a poem called A Coat. There is a great enterprise in walking naked. ये W.B. Yeats कहता है. W.B. Yeats आज कह रहा है, मीर कब कह चुका है इस चीज को. मीर और W.B. Yeats में कोई मुलाकात नहीं. But what I'm trying to say, this is why we study literature. Because we try to find the points, which are the points of recognition, points of affinity, how we can develop points of affinity and move forward. So I have just given you some points to ponder, to think about. You can develop your own, because as I said in the beginning, everyone has his own way of understanding literature and trying to understand why I literature, why I study literature. So this is how. So we will you like to ask questions right now or at the end? Let us have it at the end. Because I'll deliver another lecture, right?
I asked them to ask questions. They said we have questions, but he has asked us to raise the question.
Let's be back now. The second part of my talk would be reading literature comparatively. And I'm told that you have lots of questions. And as always, time is short, but life is long, don't worry. So we'll come back to your questions. I'll take your questions. I'll be very happy. In fact, the whole magic lies and the whole beauty lies in conversation rather than one-way traffic. Reading literature comparatively, this is the title of the talk, and this begins with a story. And this begins with a story which is my story, and that is why I'm going to address you this afternoon. In the 70s, late 60s actually, English literary studies in India started changing its face. British literature was taught in all the Indian universities, canonical British literature, all the Indian universities, irrespective of state, language, culture, anything. But in 60s, the change started coming in. I'm telling you this very interesting story for you. That is why I brought this story to you. And this is via me, who is standing between two generations. In the late 60s, a very interesting institution was established in Hyderabad known as American Studies Research Center, which is no longer there. Because that was the time of PL 480 and America used to push lots of money in India for its own propagation, and literature and teaching and literature was one of its focus. So they started American Literature Studies Center in America. That was the time in the late 60s and early 70s that everyone started thinking of American literature. And they pushed so much of money that whole volumes of American literature, the books that were made available to Indian students, published by number of press, were available for 5 rupees and 10 rupees, which was nothing. The idea was to propagate American literature. So in the 70s, American literature got very popular. So the shift was in the late 60s from British literature to American literature. By the end of the 70s, the situation changed drastically. And then comes Indian writing in English. And with the Indian writing in English, a few years later, a literature known as Commonwealth literature, which is now known as post-colonial literature, because it passed through several names. Third world literature, post-colonial was the last, new literatures in English, and finally, post-colonial literature. So this is a time of great change, starting from British to American to post-colonial, later part, and so many things were happening. It was a time of great transformation in English literary studies. Towards the 90s, a huge change came in, and that was regional literatures making their way into English departments. Literatures of regions, literatures of small or little lesser known languages or lesser known literary traditions. Like, for example, we started thinking of Northeast literature. No one thought about Northeast literature earlier. So much literature was being produced from Shillong and from Assam and from various other places. Then came in the departments of English researches, which were not purely English research, but English and Urdu, English and Hindi, English and Gujarati, and so on and so forth. So you are at a particular point where English literary studies is no longer English literary studies. It is English plus many things else, many things, which is regional studies, which is other linguistic studies, which is cultural studies, and so on and so forth. Lots of things are happening. After I started teaching in the year 1979, in Jamia. Before that, I had taught a year earlier at a temporary position at the place from where I come. And after that, after I joined, I found that this change had already made its mark. The change was very visible. So I kept on teaching British literature and American literature in the classroom for a long time. But after 15 years or so, I started feeling that my growth was very limited. That my English literary studies was बहुत महदूद कर दिया था उसने मुझको. It had not given me any feeling to look beyond. So it all happened by chance, you can say, that while teaching John Donne, I quoted Ghalib once, because Ghalib and John Donne come very close to each other in terms of imagination, imaginative vitality, and in terms of conceits that Donne creates and Ghalib creates. So when I quoted Ghalib while teaching John Donne, मैंने देखा कि हमारे स्टूडेंट्स की आंखें खुल गई. Then I realized that there is something in my own language which I can bring to this with great profit. Then I started searching, where are my points of my own belonging? I found my point of belonging in the literary texts which were in my language. And luckily, I had some training in Persian. That was very fortunate for me because I had to learn Persian in the school. And after passing my MA examination, I also learned again Persian with Maulana at my place. And that helped me 20 years later. So my Persian, my Urdu came to my rescue. And then I started thinking of South Asian literatures. India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. I started writing essays on that. And that is how this book came, Socio-Literary Cultures in South Asia. I started thinking of translation because with translation only I can think about comparative. Because translation is a part and parcel of comparative. And that is how my another book came in translation, published by Maureen Black Swan, in translation, positions and paradigms. Those were the days when I had already started translating Ghalib and writing on Ghalib. And that is after many, many years that this book has come, which you were referring to, Maria was referring to, The Essential Ghalib. So this is the story of my own growth. And I wanted to tell this personal story because there lies my excuse for being a comparatist. When you compare one literary text with another, you come to identify yourself as a teacher, as an academic, as a student, and as one who is a citizen of a particular place, but has her eyes and ears are open to others, to patients also. So comparative studies is nothing new. It has been there for ages. But people generally thought of comparative studies in terms of two linguistic or two cultural or two anthropological situations in which they were working. So in Europe, there was a different kind of a concept of comparative literature. But in India, there was a still different kind of things that we were thinking about. So between two languages, but my area of interest was not between two languages, but within the same language. Like, for example, within Urdu itself, or Persian itself, or English itself, there are many ways of comparing and contrasting. What do we compare and contrast? That is another story. The whole lecture would be required for that. But comparing, broadly speaking, the linguistic patterns, the way of recognition, how do we recognize a particular experience? What is history? What is this particular myth that I'm trying to create in my literary text? There are so many ways. And how one thing corresponds to another. And how ultimately human material, human experience, human culture, this tradition, this whole cultural patterns and how they are, explored. So that is how I came to comparative literature. So there are many ways of comparing and contrasting. And that is how comparative literature has made its way very importantly in our syllabi today. It's a different matter though. Gayatri Spivak about 7-8 years ago said that comparative literature is dead. She sees no future for comparative literature. Because the irony is this, that in many of the Indian universities, and despite of what we are talking about comparative literature, there are not many departments of comparative literature. But there is a huge demand and there is a huge, need to study comparative literature. Huge need for. So you have Jadavpur University, a full-fledged department. There are a couple of departments in Gujarat and here and there, and one in South in Kerala. So a couple of universities are working in comparative. But my contention is that comparative literature, translation studies, because they go together hand in hand. These are two disciplines in which the future lies for Indian academia, for Indian students. There is huge demand and there is a huge need for comparative literature. And therefore, you can enter into it because this is something which has a future. Even though the ground is not very well prepared, but it's you who are going to prepare that ground if you wish. आपको एक छोटी सी मिसाल देके बस खत्म कर दूंगा उसी पे. I came back again to my own root, that is Mir Dr. Mir, whom I love a lot. मीर के 6 शेर है हमारे पास, 5 या 6 शेर होंगे, और उसमें सब में एक ही इमेज है या वर्ड है या मेटाफर है या सिंबल है या मिथ है, वो है दीवार. आपको सिर्फ सुना देता हूँ बिकॉज उतना टाइम नहीं. आप देखिएगा कैसे ये हाउ दिस वॉल, दिस दीवार कीप्स ऑन चेंजिंग. बैठा किसी दीवार के, याद है, साए के तले मीर, नक्शे कदम राह रवा गिन रहा होगा. बैठा किसी दीवार के साए के तले मीर, नक्शे कदम राह रवा गिन रहा होगा. This is one share in which he is thinking of दीवार. Now दीवार here is a simple image, but it could be many more. It could have many more meanings. रात मजलिस में तेरी हम भी खड़े थे चुपके. This is another शेर. जैसे तस्वीर लगाते कोई दीवार के साथ. दीवार has a different meaning here. Then you have दरवाजे पे खड़ा हूं कई दिन से यार के, हैरत ने इश्क ने मुझे दीवाना कर दिया. फोर्थ शेर इज तस्वीर से दरवाजे पे हम उसके खड़े हैं, इंसान को हैरान भी दीवार करे. नादर दीवार. मजलिस में तेरी मुझको, मजलिस में तेरी हमको कब गैर खुश लगे है, हम उसके अपने, हम बीच उसके अपने दीवार खींचते हैं. मजलिस में गैर के कब मुझको भला लगे है, हम बीच उसके अपनी दीवार खींचते हैं. जमी गिर हो, ये बहुत सीरियस शेर है. जमी गिर हो इससे तू के एक दिन कब्र में जाना है. जमी गिर हो इज से तू के एक दिन ये दीवार का साया दीवार होगा. And the sixth, this is the sixth shear. Now, no time to enter into the comparative praxis of all these 6 verses, but you will find hundreds and thousands of such examples which you can explore, where it works as a word, where it works as a simile, where it works as a metaphor, where it works as a symbol, where it works as a myth, and how the poet takes a long breath, and how it also impels you, disturbs you, agitates you, and finally wants to understand him and the world through him. So this is a very interesting area that you are, many people say कि engineering पढ़ते तो बहुत अच्छा होता. लिटरेचर पढ़ के आपने कोई गलत काम नहीं किया, आपने बहुत अच्छा काम, आप इंसान बन रहे हैं. सो मुबारक हो आपको. लेट्स चलिए जो सवाल जवाब है करते हैं.
आप यहाँ बैठे थे सर,
हाँ ठीक है.
और माइक है, ये है वो माइक.
हाँ ठीक है.
यहाँ पर
यलगार हो. मुगल आजम में अकबर कहते हैं यलगार हो. अगेंस्ट दिस सन ही सेड यलगार. देखा मुगल आजम? नहीं देखा है तो कुछ भी नहीं देखा. देखिए 2 ही फिल्में बनी है, मुगल आजम और दूसरा इसमें गब्बर सिंह का क्या नाम था? Only 2 films. Yes, please. Come on.
yes, please start.
We are in a very close hall, your own friends together. हमारी एक दोस्त जो पढ़ाती है अमेरिकन को बड़ी दोस्ती की बहुत बड़ी प्रोफेसर है जो कहते हैं कि हमारे स्टूडेंट्स ये कहते हैं कि आस्क एनी सिली क्वेश्चन because your silly question is very important for me because silly questions open ways for bigger questions. So come on, you're welcome.
How we are living in a post-colonial world, and every literature that we are reading becomes post-colonial, it becomes somehow political. And my question is that was literature ever truly devoid of a sense of resistance? Because whenever we read literature, it does have beauty, it does have a lot of other things, but we find that resistance is always a theme, not a theme exactly, but resistance is always somewhere there, maybe in a moment or in a very explicit manner. So
I greatly appreciate your question. It's a very sensitive question and very well taken. You are very sharp mind, I must tell you. There is no literature if there is no resistance. It's resistance that makes you right. When you hold a pen, it's you are answering your own ego with some amount of resistance. The writer resists, that is why he's a writer. Go to the first earliest text of say Chaucer. Look at the stories that you must have read from Chaucer, Canterbury Tales. Look at the wife of Bath, right? You must have read that. Canterbury Tales. You will see the resistance in there with the wife of Bath. Any text that you take. What I said, you are very right. The post-colonial world is became the signature. Resistance became the signature. Because the post-colonial world is a product of the colonization of thousands of years. And not less than 100 years of each civilization, each country. So that voice of resistance was much more profound, much more powerfully, much more clearly heard in our times. After 1947, here you can say, or anywhere else. So starting in the 20th century itself, this world literature, wherever you went, wherever these colonized countries were, this power of resistance became very important. But resistance has been at the root of all writing. Actually, writing in itself is protest. Writing itself is a protest. It's not all the time affirmation. Because affirmation has no material, no flame in it. Saying yes is no flame, it doesn't have any flame. Saying no has flame into it, it has power into it. Even in love poems, there is a resistance. You go to the extreme. There is a resistance of the lover against the beloved or the beloved. So the whole poetry is full of resistance in love. John Donne's beloved resists. Resistance is the hallmark of literature. Yes, please.
I think there are various shades of meaning in any literary text. Certainly, resistance is something that disturbs the mind. But at the same time, there are some poems which are for submission. Like बहुत सारे उर्दू में हैं जैसे religious poems. Okay, that is for submission, complete submission. Qasida or बहुत सारे नाथ है हिंदी में क्या होता है so that is also something, but that's not yeah. So that is also a part of
Interestingly, this reminds me that even in religious process, for instance, the person who has suffered, जो गुनहगार है, शिकायत कर रहा है अल्लाह से और कहता है कि आप मुझे ये क्यों नहीं दिया? So that is also a resistance. और बंदे का रूठना तो हक है उसका। हमें तो वो अल्लाह पसंद है, इसको निपटा देते हैं, लेकिन उसको अच्छी तरह। तो रेजिस्टेंस है, रेजिस्टेंस बहुत है।
Javed Akhtar says that Urdu poetry started with resistance. Urdu poetry especially. That was not religious in the beginning. It started with resistance.
The first Urdu poet, Kuli Qutub Shah, जैसे पूरी दीवान है, that is why he's called the first Urdu poet. और रेजिस्टेंस से पहली गजल उसकी है, पियाबाज प्याला पिया जाए ना, पियाबाज जब दिल जिया जाए ना, रेजिस्टेंस है। कहीं थे पिया बिन सुबूरी करूं, कहिए जाए किया जाए, नहीं कर सकते, सबर करने का। नहीं इश्क जिसको बड़ा तोड़ है, कभी उससे मिल बेच किया जाए, इश्क नहीं करता उसके साथ नहीं, रेजिस्टेंस है। और आखिरी शेर इस गजल का क्या है वो, कुतुब शाह न दे मुझ दीवाने को, मुझको मत समझाइए, बंद 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 दीजिए। कुतुब शाह न दे मुझ दीवाने को, बंद बंद मतलब एडवाइस, दीवाने को कुछ बंद दिया जाए, दीवाना है रहेंगे आप, बोलिए हमको कुछ। प्योर रेजिस्टेंस, दिस इज द फर्स्ट उर्दू बुक। क्या रेजिस्टेंस है पूरी कुतुब शाह के। हैदराबाद तो उसके मिलेवेट के नाम पे है। भागवती was the lady whom they loved, who later became उसका खुद मुस्लिम वाले 12 नाम था, so he had 12 believers only, so one after another, so फिर उसने एक नाम इसके, जब उसने वो बनाया चार मीनार, बस उसका पूरे शहर का नाम किया था, उससे उसने देवी का नाम किया था। So this lady called Bhagwati became Hyderabad, and Hyderabad के नाम पे जो शहर बसा उसका नाम हैदराबाद।
It's not a question, but an element. While we are talking about resistance, and we are in a world where we know that the narrative is held by a certain power. Um, it can be a male perspective or a political way, or a political way in which narrative is governed or rather created. So, is it that the resistance which we are talking about, which is a kind of, which gives us a solace or a kind of affection or affirmation that there is something which we are penning down or documenting? But is it that in the world where narratives are created, will this resistance be recorded and will it be taken in consideration and given the due, time and energy which it requires to carry forward so that there comes a change which the resistance originally is talking about? In a world precisely in the 21st century where narratives are created every day and every individual is led into or influenced into believing in one sort of narrative. So it's not a question but a dilemma which I go through every single day when I read literature as an individual and when I engage my students with literature. Because the number of times they do come up with certain ideas for which I'm clueless and without any answer.
You teach here?
Yes, sir, at Women's College.
What's your name?
Fazia Fari.
Fazia. I would just simply sit down. When we think of literature, we should think of solutions. Solutions are nowhere. Literature in resistance is lies the answer. The very idea of resisting itself is an answer. Because if solutions are provided, then the whole tug of history comes to an end. They exist because there is something which doesn't suit us. We speak because we need to speak up. So thinking of a solution will bring the civilization to an end. Solutions will bring us to an end. And created this world as it has been created by God has been created as very mysterious material. The terrestrial power and the earthly power. And the dark between two. I would advise you not to study the literature is important here. It has access to these things. My next book is on these essential wisdom. This sounds so I don't know that it is all padi. लेकिन आप पेड़ पढ़िए, पेड़ will give you this answer by existence. What a tragedy that we lived for 80 years. He was buried in Lucknow. And the place where he was buried, railway lines were calculated. और उनके सीने पे रोजाना सैकड़ों पेड़ की पटरियों के साथ सीना लगता है। और इमेजिन करिए, मीर ने पहले कहा था, मत तो बंदे मीर को हटाओ, मैंने तो गरीब का निशान, मत तो बंदे मतलब मत तो बंदे मीर को हटाओ, रहने दो गरीब का निशान। सो प्रोफेटिक सभी को कैसे पता था कि हमारे सीने पे पेड़ की पटरियां बिछ रही है, तो solution है नहीं, because solution is the end. World is lost. Writing is lost. We are all curious humans. I don't think I answer you.
Yes, the dilemma has to continue.
The last question. The magic lens.
It's very, very fascinating.
Yes, come in.
But I think our life will end that concept of money. But having the role of me to protect it. So this role will continue and then there will be that same and someone else will carry forward the
क्या शेर पढ़ा आपने?
Sarhane Mir क्या है इसका बोलो अभी
ये फर्स्ट है। सब लोग कहते हैं ये शेर पढ़ा, ये गलत है। सिराने मीर के कोई ये सही है। सिराने मीर के कोई
So just as we discussed how you said that over a span of 700 years, there are certain names that we remember, like Iliad or Gulf or Yeats or if के बारे में तो we've heard कि शेर खुद बोल उठता है कि मैं इकबाल के अलावा किसी और की मिल्कियत हो नहीं सकता. How is it possible that over a span of such a huge time, we just have these certain names when it comes to poetry or literature for that matter? So are poets born or are they made? Similarly, we still have contemporary Urdu poetry or English poetry, but we are still sort of hung up on Ghalib Iqbal. I'm not trying to demean or undermine their respect, but or is it the fact that when the poet dies, it's then we realize कि भाई हाँ वो क्या शेर कहते थे या क्या बात कह गए.
There are many things that you said. Canonical it is only canon. So the canon doesn't have many names. Canon is very short. Literally. When I was thinking of doing Ghalib, I did Ghalib, and the next was very naturally Mir. Now I asked myself, who could be the third important poet that I should bring to the English reader? मुझे अभी तक भी नजर नहीं आया. मैं सोचता था दर्द, किसी ने कहा मुसफ़ी, किसी ने कहा नहीं साहब वो सौदा बहुत बड़े. Now I can't name the third one who I want to bring to the English reader. It's very difficult. So canon is in every literature. Not only Urdu, Alim and Mir, उसके बाद not that poets were not there. Very important poets and writers are there. Quratulain Haidar, for example. अगर आप रोज में जाइए, इसमें चौपाई, for example. Lots of people are there. But and especially the 20th century has been a very fertile ground for poets and writers. Very, very fertile ground. Because of the historical changes that have taken place all over the world. So they are very important. All literatures have brought us. To the North India, but if you go to the linguistic clusters of South, you have great writers there. The translation का भला होकर बैको मोहम्मद बशीर आप तक पहुंच गए. Otherwise, you would have known who was Bako Mohammed Bashir, who wrote a very ordinary person and wrote such powerful stories. So this is a difficult question to answer. Why only few? Not that only these few are important. There are many more who are. For example, Siraj Aurangabadi को कम याद करते हैं. सिराज का क्या शेर है, खबरें ताहिर सुन न जानू नहीं. Yes, इसलिए वो कहने के लिए था खबरें सुन न जानू नहीं. लोग कहते हैं तू पूरा हाल तो रहा तू नहीं सुन नहीं. So what I'm trying to say that it's very difficult to answer this question. How many more are there? Many more are there. But I discussed my only name John Donne and Marvel, but there are many other metaphysicals. John Thrasher is a very important metaphysician. but we don't read one for every all. So that happens in every age. And there are individual references. For example, when we talk of romantics, I personally like Coleridge because Wordsworth speaks of one-to-one correspondence most of the time. But Coleridge speaks in a bardic because bardic hero is a grand hero. It's a very different kind of material. Bardic hero is very powerful. So that way you come across actually capital and gems.
One more question was
From this side.
no, last one question. Are poets born?
Are poets born or they are? I think they are born, but they're also they have to work on their poetry. And the good example of that working on poetry is the facsimile edition of the library होगा देखिएगा facsimile edition of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Wasteland का पूरा छपा हुआ volume है. You will see there that how Ezra Pound has corrected those lines. And that sent me thinking कि भाई क्या हुआ इधर भी लोग Ezra Pound की poem हो गई. Because the shortest poem that Wasteland, Death by Water, is 6 lines or 7 lines, something like that. And T.S. Eliot had written 2 full pages on that. And it's about said it's not required, only 6 lines will do. So poets are made also. And he, interestingly, Eliot was so humble, he dedicated that poem to T.S. Eliot saying, ill Wiggler Fabulum, the better craftsman. देखिए Eliot भी बहुत चला है, craftsman कहा है, poet नहीं कहा. आप अच्छे कारीगर हो शायरी के, तो आपने कारीगरी की काट छाट कर दिया. But he did not call a better poet, better craftsman. You know the craft of poetry, and therefore you have cut and pasted my poem, and it's a great poem, no doubt about that. There's no doubt about that.
We have in our corridor in the Department of English, we have one photo for editing. Various poems were edited. I'm sure they have seen it. See it.
Even in the context of late Name, we can say that he was a born poet, but there was a great influence of Sirajuddin and
Training, असली training उनसे हासिल की थी. We had learned from various sources. तो बहुत ही खराब जिंदगी गुजारी, लेकिन चलो उनको बहुत बहुत इज्जत भी मिली, बहुत मिली. और लास्ट में जब वो लखनऊ पहुंचे हैं, तो बाद में बहुत उनको सारा कुछ हुआ नहीं किया. लेकिन सैलरी खर्च को बस यही कहा, खामियाजू जिनको कहते हैं, उनके मामूजात वो थे, तो उनसे बहुत सीखा हुआ.
is that you are a poet, and I also try time at poetry. I have noticed that sometimes it happens that sometimes it becomes very difficult to write a single line in many days, and while at other times, the entire poem flows out in an hour. So does it happens to every poet, or this experience is everyone?
This happens, yes. And it happens to most of us who are here.
Not only poetry, or anything.
And
For examination, not much.
आपको consciousness की बात छुपी बैठी. You have a very good example in Kubla Khan. How Kubla Khan was written? He wrote it in a dream. And the man from Porlock walked the door and he spoiled the whole game. And he suddenly pinned down those lines that he had. When you read Kubla Khan, you will see that after 10 or 15 lines, there is a break of rhythm. Because that is the point when he forgot the poem and then he wrote the poem. So one was spontaneous and the other was worked upon. So it happens with every line. अब here कहते हैं आपको पता अंदाजा होगा कि some come to you which you never revise, and some other comes which you revise many times, and even then you are not very satisfied. It happens.
So when we are reading poetry in different languages, there is a very particular problem that we encounter. And
Are you a poet?
sometimes I write. And that problem is actually whether it's a particular quality of the language that makes poetry in that particular language beautiful. For example, when we read Urdu poetry, we are suddenly attracted towards it, but when we are reading Hindi poetry, we are not. And I said to my cousin this thing, but he was not approved of it. And then I recited a poetry of Fez, and he suddenly said, ah. And then I said a poetry of Hindi as well, and then he was not, means not spontaneously reacted to it. So should I recite that poetry again? It is just a couplet of Fez. Okay. कि कई बार इसकी खातिर जर्रे जर्रे का जिगर चीरा, कई बार इसकी खातिर जर्रे जर्रे का जिगर चीरा, मगर ये चश्मे हैरान की जिसकी हैरानी नहीं जाती, कई बार इसकी खातिर, कई बार इसका दामन भर दिया उसने दो आलम से, मगर ये दिल है कि इसकी खाना बिरानी नहीं जाती.
You are talking about the mellifluousness of language. Urdu by its nature is a very mellifluous language, very musical. And that is why the popularity of Urdu poetry especially. And also the popularity of ghazal, because ghazal has a rhyme pattern, therefore it is sung everywhere. I don't want to comment on any other poem or any other language because that may not be right. But Urdu by its nature, Persian by its nature, and Arabic by its nature, because that is the line from Arabic to Persian to Urdu. And then in other languages which are not the languages proper, but in dialects also you have that musicality. So it's a matter of how the ears respond, because the poem is in the ear. And there's another poem which is in the eye. So there are many poems, all poems are in the eye, but some poems live in your ears. So it varies from language to language. Musical mellifluousness that comes to it. So you are right that some languages are very mellifluous, and therefore, as far as you are enamored by fair, most of us are. But I would advise you to read Moonbeam Russian, who was born during the same time, 1909 and 10. Three poets were born in Urdu: Faiz, Miraji, and Moonbeam Russian. Everyone talks of Faiz and Faiz. No one knows about Miraji and Moonbeam Rashid. Definitely, Moonbeam Rashid was a far greater poet than Faiz. Read Moonbeam Rashid. Rashid wrote one poem called Hassan Huzagar. पढ़िएगा मेरा केस नेट में पढ़िएगा हसन हुजागर फैज लिरिक्स फैज का कॉन्टेम्परेरी रेलेवेंस बहुत है प्रोग्रेसिव राइटर्स मूवमेंट था दुनिया में बहुत कुछ हो रहा था Faiz was politically very conscious. It was a very important poem, no doubt about that. But Miraji and Moonbeam Rashid are different. They are not writing for their times, they are writing for different time scale and different generations. Yes, please.
Translator. When we translate something, if we are going to translate any book about whether it's poetry or fictional novel or something, what should we focus on? Whether we should focus on words or the essence of the message, what should be the main focus?
In translating, you cannot choose one. You have to take the text in totality. First, you have to take the text in totality, read it many times so that the text becomes, to a great extent, your own text. You become that text. And in that process, you become that author. So you have to don the garb of that author. And then you can probably think of translating that author. Because translation is not an off-hand exercise. You read many times a particular poet, and then you feel like communicating with him. You feel like being with him. So once you become a part and parcel of his personality in some way or the other, you can think of the worldview that he has developed. So you cannot choose language translation or metaphor translation. You can't do it partly or message translation because these are not the things that you can label. It's about okay, this is hard to translate or certainty or definiteness. No, the total text. The atmosphere of the text, the temperament of the text, the totality, the text in its totality, how it responds, how you respond to that. That the spirit has. Yes, please.
So,
एक मिनट
yes, yeah. So, thank you for a very wonderful lecture. I'll just get back to the starting of your lecture where you pointed out that AI has come onto the scene and it's a very interesting time. And then you also say that you do not know much about AI, right? But then you're also working in the field of translation, comparative literature, and everything else. So, my point is, being a translator, being someone who's working in the field of comparative literature, how do you see the advent of AI? Because there is a great tug of war going on between what is literature and what is not. And since you pointed out that even an FIR is a piece of literature, so there is this case of authorship. Who's the author now? Who's going to be author now? And what is going to happen to literature going forward? It's very interesting. Just something that I wanted to point out. Uh, the death of literature has been pointed out again and again over the 1990s since the beginning of computer sciences. And if many of you would not know that people who are working in the field of AI were the people who were working in the field of literature in the beginning, right? So the demolition of literature is built on the advent of AI, right? So there is a very famous article written by Rakesh Bong which says that what is digital humanities and what is it doing in English departments? Okay, so how again coming back to you, sir, because you are a translator, someone who's teaching also, who's also a writer, how do you see the advent of AI in, going forward and the role of authority?
AI has made great advances. Chat GTP. What happened was that I have written some commentary on a verse, which a friend of mine saw, and by return email he sent me a GTP interpretation of that verse. I never knew GTP can also interpret verses. So GTP interpreted that verse, and there were many points of similarity and many points of difference. My interpretation was one, but GTP said something very, very different. Death of the text has been, death of the author has been already pronounced many, many years ago, several decades ago. But author itself is it seems to be a figment of imagination. Now, who is author now? It's a very difficult time to reconcile with. And we do not know how literature is going to survive. It will, but in a different shape, I understand. I can probably afford being ignorant because I'm in the last leg of my journey. But you cannot. Because if you stay behind, then probably you will lose much. मुझे याद है कि one of my vice, I was sitting with him, I was a student advisor at this. So Rashid साहब my vice. तो प्रिंटर से पेपर निकल रहा था या आपको एक और चीज मैसेज आता है क्या होता है दोस्तों so that paper I tried to put बच्चों ये अपने आप आ जाएगा छोड़ दो इसको then he said कि मैं तो नहीं रहूंगा तुम देखोगे कैसा रेवोल्यूशन आने वाला है 10 साल के अंदर मैंने देखा 20 साल में दुनिया बदल गई बशीर साहब इस नॉट उन्होंने ये कहा था मुझसे मैं तो नहीं रहूंगा तुम देखना कितना बड़ा रेवोल्यूशन आने वाला है he was the person who started computer center in our industry because he saw the future. Computer Center was started by Bashir Saab. Bashiruddin Ahmad was a great man. कभी यूनिवर्सिटी की गाड़ी इस्तेमाल नहीं क्यों तो उसका सही future holds impossible things. मेरे हिसाब से लगता है बहुत मुश्किल है यानी कैसे how our children are going to they have debate. For example, I can't handle my bank accounts I can't buy things online, etc., etc. And I don't want to learn also because something I don't want to know the geography of the place where I live now because I live in a particular place for 36, 40 years. And now I've shifted to a new city. I don't want to know the geography. This is what the company has built there. But I want to live at peace and do my work whatever time is there. So it's very difficult time and very enterprising time, very challenging time that I'm in. बहुत इबादत करना ही होगा
And that's not about
Has to teach something. Teaching. Yeah.
the idea is that it's talking about the author being there. In performance studies, we do now have plays which are being enacted at the same time while they are being written by the ChatGPT. There is a software which is writing the play according to the responses being
It
received.
is said that Shakespeare also did it.
So where will the writer be? His stages are going to turn like
Identity of the writer is in crisis. Definitely. Identity of the writer is in crisis. Great crisis. Albert Pinto wrote a book called Crisis in Modern in English Poetry. The crisis is very much there now.
Ah,
So it's basically an extension of that question. Since we'll be discussing about poetry for an hour and you have certain inclination towards poetry, so how would you understand the relevance of poetry in classroom teaching?
Relevance of poetry. Yes. I taught poetry only all my career, mostly. In the beginning, something was given to me, so I taught that, but my heart lay there. Because I thought that through that my students can grow better. Fiction was one-to-one correspondence in most of the cases. Poetry goes deeper, and I thought that if someone can appreciate poetry, one can understand and appreciate life so much better. It was finer than fiction, finer than non-fiction books, etc. And I wanted to take my students with me by doing the whole. So it was not only one-to-one kind of a thing, not a one-sided affair, but I wanted to take them, engage them in conversation and doing the text. And this worked very well by teaching us the baseline, because baseline cannot be a one channel, say, communication. A student has to be taken into account. So in every text, I understand, unless the student becomes a part. But I understand this is far more practicable in terms of fiction. But in poetry, I tried to develop that, and it worked very well. And that is why we dramatize some of the poems. Like, for example, My Last Duchess is a very dramatic poem, so we could dramatize it also sometimes. I also try to make my students read the poems in different voices, so you can see how many meanings can finally emerge from one particular poem that you have. So there are many ways of reading a text, especially in poetry. Your own voice matters there, the voice of the student. And you try to, if you are a teacher, you try and experiment with your students. Ask every student to read the same stanza, and they will come in different ways with intonations. And in intonations lie the meaning. In intonations lie the implications. So there are very interesting ways of teaching. It has been made into a dramatic kind of classroom in which interaction takes. The best classroom is that classroom where interaction, where the student is friendly with the teacher, and the distance, that distance is lessened. At the same time, the distance is maintained as well. I very much believe in the distance between the student and teacher, but at the same time, very close to the student. This far, no further, but very, very close. So that is how I think you can take it.
So please consider this as a question from someone who wants to start maybe writing. Do we already know when writing poetry where it's going to go from the very beginning? Or do we let the poetry unfold itself in whatever way it can?
It has to be left to unfold itself. It has to be left to unfold itself in its own way. You cannot dictate the poem's way, the poem's journey. The poem requires its own journey. It finds its own line length, the volume, the velocity. What happens with my translation, because there's another way of writing the poem also when you are doing the translation. So I weigh the word, the volume of the word, the weight of the word, the length of the word, and how these words will be put in a particular line, and what will be the length of that line, and the length especially of the second line that follows, and the third that follows. So if there is so much of disparity, your rhythm will be disturbed. So the words of the same size, same volume, जैसे आप मोती को तोड़ते हैं ना उसका आप देखते हैं हीरे को तोड़ते हैं तो देखते हैं कितना है इसका volume. So the volume, the weight, and its length. So they are put like pearls in a string, and finally that comes up. Because if the first line is too long, this is my way of doing the translation or poetry also. The second line is too short, the rhythm is affected. So that is a kind of an engineering that we do with the words and with the line length. Line length matters a lot. That creates a harmony in the text. that creates larger harmony in the text. Let's go then, you and I, with the evening aspect, we will see that. We will see that it's flowing on its own. Read any poem, it flows on its own, older or newer. So that is, and even in performance poetry, we see this. Because in performance poetry, this is far more important because it is in the performance that the rhythm of the line comes out.
So it's
Resist किया आपको resist किया इन्होंने resist किया आपको इन्होंने
Not exactly a question, but rather a experience sharing thing that I want to do that. यहाँ पे इतना vast study ना poetry में और history में कोई ऐसी poem हो या कोई भी ऐसा कुछ lines हो जो that are stuck with you. तो आपको हमेशा मतलब बाकी आप कितना कुछ भी पढ़ते रहेंगे और उससे move on हो जाए. लेकिन कोई एक ऐसी poetry या कुछ lines जो आप always come back to it.
I have very much like W.H. and T.S. Eliot, those on the modern poets I've liked. And lots of T.S. Eliot I could recite. For example, Wasteland I taught for a very long time, so उस ज़माने तक तो बहुत याद आपको भूल ही गए. Similarly, W.H. I could remember a lot, and he has stayed with me for a long time. Because W.H. is probably the most important poet of all the ones. And someone said he is the last romantic of the first modern. So Yeats, lines of Yeats have stayed with me, lines of Yeats have stayed with me. As far as my own language is concerned, many other words have stayed with me. Starting from Quli Qutb Shah to now, many words have stayed with me. To name a few, Quli Qutb Shah himself, after that, Wali, Aurangabadi, then Siraj Aurangabadi, Khaja Mirdad, for 18th century, then Mir in 18th century, then come to Ghalib and so on, etc. So similarly, Coleridge has stayed with me, and Wordsworth, parts of Wordsworth. So that way there are quite a few that one has worked with. आप कुछ कह रहे थे?
सर मैं अपनी जुबान में बात करने की कोशिश करूं क्योंकि दिल से जो बात निकलती है असर लगती है पढ़ने की ताकत है परवाज़ मगर लगती है तो बहुत कम अल्फाज हैं जिसमें मैं सारे तशक्कुर अदा कर सकूं आप
There are some foreigners also.
सब
There are foreigners also, but should take care of it.
Oh, I'm sorry. So in English language, maybe in my own language as well, I fall short of words in which I can manifest my feelings actually. However, like we've been Facebook friend for quite some time, and I keep learning from you.
What's your name?
My name is Baram Ha.
Oh,
Yes.
मुझे लगा ये तो बहुत बड़ा नाम कोई शख्स होगा, पता नहीं क्या होगा.
नहीं सर यही अपना सा इंसान है और मैं सीखता आया हूँ हमेशा लेकिन आज जो इन पर्सन सीखने से जो फीलिंग्स है मेरी वो बहुत अलग है. I'm sorry again. My feelings are very different, and that's why I'm going back to my mother tongue probably. And I'm highly grateful for each and everything that you've talked about. I have studied, for my PhD, I have worked on linguistic affinity, especially from Khani Arzu's point of view, the San and Talaq, the concept that he gave, and which was later on elaborated by Sir William Jones. And probably that has encouraged me to study about the similarities and the differences between the languages. And these days I'm highly interested in researching on metaphors. And you talked about metaphors today. So I was wondering, while you were translating Ghalib and all the greats from South Asia in a Western language, how do you deal with those metaphors which are very culture specific while rendering them into English? Do you take I would be highly interested in learning from you, what are the approaches that you take, especially in translating those metaphors, which are from two different cultures, basically?
It's a process of negotiation. When you talk about something difficult, you sit across the table to negotiate. when you sit across the table to negotiate with the other person, because one person is sitting on that side and one person is sitting on this side. And negotiation gives you the clue, gives you the answer. There are some culture-specific metaphors which are very difficult to translate that way. But you have to find an affinity in that to be able to transfer it in your language. To be able to translate or bring it to your own kind of a reader. Because your target reader is in the language in which you are translating. So naturally, you will find something equivalent to that which you can appreciate. For example, there's nothing like daffodil in our culture. And you might replace it to something else, which can make sense. So exact translation may not work at all sometimes. So you have to give it a different kind of an intonation or a color so that it becomes.
And like there are many color metaphors actually, which can have a very different meaning in different culture.
Very good.
It was very good.
Yes, I agree with that. Yes.
Okay. I was there as a visiting professor in Milan. And there we were conducting a workshop on translation. So, yeah, text was given. It was translating film script. So, what we did, the two teachers, me and the other teacher from there, we gave the text, written text, and that to be translated in English. So they wrote, for example, good morning, and then the whole dialogue. Then after that, we said that, okay, now let's look at this movie without dialogue. How perspective change, I'm talking about that. So we showed the movie without dialogue. And the background was poor people. So the perspective change of the written problem. They were able to see. Okay. And after that, we said that make corrections. Whatever you translated on the written text, change whatever you can. So they changed. Okay. But still, I was looking at good morning part because I knew that much only in Italian. So I was focusing on that. 1 or 2% of the participants, they could change that, but the others did not disturb good morning. Okay. And then we watched it again with dialogue, and the word was chalk, not good morning. Okay. And chalk is acceptable in any language. Here also we know what is the meaning of chalk. Okay. So this is how. This refers to your question and this question also. What is to be translated? So when in written text, it's something else. When you watch it without dialogue, when you watch it with dialogue, difference. And according to that, you need to. So he was right, and that is why the translators are also paid like authors. Because when you translate, you are actually recreating. And so, I mean, nowadays people talk of adaptation and all, but actually It's like that. So that is the whole issue of translation. And sir, I would also like to, I always refer to my students about Angur. A marvelous movie. I hope you saw it. This is an adaptation of Comedy of Errors by Shakespeare. Angur. Everything is Indian. But, and the dialogue are different, the dialogues are different, but it's an adaptation of Comedy of Errors. Lovely. Yeah, there are subtitles in there. You can see them. Any more question? Yeah, Emily.
I would just like to add something to the translation question that have been going on. My question is that whenever we have a text that is written that we are translating maybe from that we know already, maybe our mother tongue, that is from to English. And every text has its style, not exactly style, but dialect maybe. My question is more directed towards the dialect. So if a text has a dialect, so how and we are translating into a language that we have learned, and it is for an audience that is not Indian already. How do we decide that the same essence is carried in
Contemporary language, contemporary idiom of your own times and of your own temperament that suits you and the text and possibly the target reader. So the contemporary idiom is the answer. So for example, if you have to take up a text like Paradise Lost, so it has to be in the time in which you are, and of the language to which you belong, and of the times in which you speak that language.
So should I thank Professor Mr. Rama? She is who? Okay. Thank you. Thanks so much for asking questions. I think it was a lovely session, and I hope you enjoyed the question answer session also.
Yes, greatly. That was the real part of it.
Yeah. So thank you very much for responding to their questions, and I'm sure they have a lot more questions, but because of time, they are not asking it. But I'm sure you have got some further questions also. After asking the question, there are chains of questions that you can ask. And I would like to, as I was talking to Professor Anisu Chamasa, that when he talked of representation, that goes to mimesis, Aristotle's mimesis. And because mimesis, we talk of verisimilitude, lifelike. And that is also known as representation. So that is what he was talking of, that when you use this room for presentation and for representation. So representation is lifelike, verisimilitude, mimetic. So Aristotle's mimesis. I'm saying Aristotle's mimesis because Pluto also talked of mimesis. So I'm not going to that. I mean, I know Professor Anisul Aman Sahab for quite long, but I was very happy to know that he likes those authors I mean, I also like Coleridge and Yeats and Donne. So our choices are same. And my students know that, especially in literature. I don't prefer Wordsworth, I prefer Coleridge. I don't prefer Eliot, I prefer Yeats. Sorry for that. So this is our likes and dislikes. So thank you very much, sir, for being here. And I would especially like to thank you, sir, because he's very busy. You must have seen in the introduction that every day he's signing the books and visiting bookshops and places and for talks and various other things. And I'm very much thankful to him for accepting our offer, coming over here just for a day. In the earlier schedule, which was going to be starting from 14th to 18th, in that he was the chief guest in the valedictory session. But it's my loss that we could not do it today, and we shifted the date because it's from 15th to 19th, and so we are going to miss you, sir. But
I lost.
yeah, so thank you very much, sir, for